I think people are still coming in, and we certainly will welcome them as they do, but I'd like to go ahead and get started. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mark Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of Tudor Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the sixth and final program of our 2024 Landmark Lecture Series. Since our first program in March, this lecture series has explored groundbreaking techniques used to center the stories of communities traditionally marginalized in historical narratives. Last month, we engaged in a powerful conversation with descendants of individuals enslaved at Tudor Place and elsewhere. And this evening, Dr. Moten will discuss critical fabulation and the practice of Black public history. We'll begin our program this evening with our Indigenous Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, Anacostan, and Piscataway people on whose ancestral homelands Tudor Place Historic House and Garden sits. We also celebrate the vibrant Native communities who make their homes in the DC area today. Now, our 2023 Landmark Lecture Series has been supported by an Institute of Museum and Library Services Inspire grant for small museums. The views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed do not necessarily represent those of IMLS, and we are grateful to them for their financial support for this program. We're honored to conclude this year's Landmark Lecture Series with Dr. Crystal Moten. A Southside Chicago native, Dr. Moten is a public historian, curator, and writer who focuses on the intersection of race, class, and gender to uncover the hidden histories of Black people in the Midwest. The recipient of numerous awards and honors, her research has appeared in books, journals, documentaries, and other media. Dr. Moten has taught at colleges and universities across the country, and prior to joining the Obama Foundation as the inaugural curator of collections and exhibits, she works as curator of African American history in the Division of Work and Industry at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Her most recent book, Continually Working: Black Women, Community Intellectualism and Economic Justice in Postwar Milwaukee, was recently published by Vanderbilt University Press. And I will note Dr. Moten is happy to take your questions at the end of her presentation. So if you would just put those in the chat, we will field those at the end of the evening. So it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Crystal Moten.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. I am going to share my screen and just make sure you can see that. All right. So thank you so much for this wonderful invitation to participate in the Landmark Lecture Series for this year. I've been keeping myself apprised of the prior lectures that came before mine, and I'm just so honored to be in the number presenting at Tudor Place. As Mark mentioned, I am a historian of race, class, and gender, and I focus on the Midwest. And so the Midwest in terms of my geographical location. And as you think about the title of my presentation, Laborious Histories, that really plays into my careful attention to the ways in which work matters in African American history. But for today, I want to focus on the method of critical fabulation, expressly as I have explored it and used it and thought about it during my career as a public historian who focuses on African American history. So to start, I just thought I would share the agenda for today so that you'll know exactly what you are in for. So I'll give a brief introduction that I hope will situate who I am, what I study, and why I study it. Additionally, I want to move on to thinking about the method of critical fabulation, but especially for historians or for people who focus on the past. Then I want to share with you some examples of critical fabulation in practice, not as a way to come to definitive conclusions, but more as a way to explore how I use the method of critical fabulation to guide my practice in terms of questions And I will be honest and note from the very beginning that some of the questions that are posed when using the method of critical fabulation are unable, we can't answer them. And so that's why using this as a particular method and set of inquiries can help us think about the past. And so I want to share examples with you. Then I'll end with some concluding provocations that will hopefully get you thinking in terms of your own understanding of the past and how you might use the methods and the questions of critical fabulation to help in your own analysis. And then finally, as Mark mentioned, I'll open the floor for question and answer, which you can put in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer your questions as they arise. So by way of introduction, I thought I would take you back to May of 2020. May of 2020, we were about 2 months into the formal announcement of the global pandemic. And as a public historian whose workplace was the museum, my museum, the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, along with all of the other Smithsonian museums, were closed, not only to the public, but also to certain groups of staff who were not considered kind of the essential workers who would help keep the building running. And so in May of 2020, we were enduring a pandemic. As part of that pandemic, we were also in a panic because we didn't know what was going on. But for many workers across the country, there was also this moment of pause because we didn't know what was going to happen. And so some of us were forced to pause. I was one of those workers who was forced to pause. And in thinking about the pause that I encountered, I was also in the process of writing the book that Mark mentioned, Continually Working, which is a history of African-American civil rights activism focused on the Midwest, but also focused on economic justice through the exploration of jobs and employment. And so while I was supposed to be writing this book, I found myself unable to. The most that I could do, as many of us, was wake up, worry about what was going on, indulge perhaps in too much news or binge watch too many TV shows. One of my favorites was Chopped. But then, that got to be not sustaining. And so what I began to do was think about books that I could read that could edify my mind as I dealt with this pandemic panic and this required pause. One of the books that came to the fore was a wonderful book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman. Saidiya Hartman had just published this book, which explores, and this is from the description of the book, Black intimate life in New York and Philadelphia from the perspective of Black women in those cities. Many of these young Black women created forms of intimacy and kinship that were indifferent to both respectability politics and the law. And so in this book, Saidiya Hartman explored how these women cleaved, as she notes, and cast off lovers, exchanged sex to subsist, and revised the meaning of marriage. What was so interesting about this book was that Saidiya Hartman used the method of critical fabulation. And she had been exploring this method for over a decade. And I'll talk about when she originally came to the idea of critical fabulation. But as I began to read Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, this passage, which is on the initial pages of the book, really rang out to me, where Hartman says, every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of historical actor. So here she was exploring and making the point that historians or people who are concerned with the past, of peoples whose stories have been marginalized, pushed to the side, erased, and discounted, are always in conflict with the archive. We're in conflict with the archive in terms of the ways in which the power dynamic is illuminated by the sources that are available to be studied and by the interpretations that can be gleaned from those studies based on the historiography and the history that has already been written. And so Saidiya Hartman began this book with this statement as a way to trouble the notion, right, that historical narrative and historical method is one that can be applied generally across the board. She understood that certain groups require different methods. And this was really intriguing to me, again, as a scholar who focuses on Black working class history, Black business histories, and Black public history, especially when we think about the dearth of primary source materials that are available related to those topics. And additionally, as I was thinking about the dearth of materials in the collection, in the national collections of the Smithsonian related to African American history, we know that there are obvious absences. And so Saidiya Hartman offers us a method to think about those absences and a way to pose questions to help us fill the gaps and silences. And so, as I noted, while Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments came out in 2019, and I read it in 2020, Saidiya Hartman had been long thinking about the method of critical fabulation, which I want to explore and define right now. So in 2008, Saidiya Hartman writes an article entitled Venus in Two Acts. It's her way of trying to critically understand the lives of enslaved people, and particularly an enslaved girl who she came across in the archive. And so she defines and she explains the practice of critical fabulation. And she says, the intention here isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. This double gesture can be described as straining against the limits of the archive to write a cultural history of the captive, and at the same time, enacting the impossibility of representing the lives of captives precisely through the process of narration. And so, as you notice in the quote that I have emphasized portions of this quote, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible, to precisely narrate the lives of people who were held captive. And now this becomes really important because traditional historians, and I'll note that Saidiya Hartman does not consider herself a traditional historian. Instead, she has been identified as a literary critic, right, as a critical author, but not particularly a historian, although she is concerned with the past. And so critical historians have been traditional historians, I should say, have been critical of Hartman's methods because of the insistence on traditional history of relying on archival sources. Archival sources, be they traditional text sources or objects in a museum collection, but traditional sources nonetheless. And so it's important to understand that Saidiya Hartman is saying that when she encounters a fragment in the archive, she doesn't stop there. She uses that fragment to then begin to explore through additional research, both primary and secondary, the ways in which she can labor, right, to paint as full a picture as possible, and to do this precisely. And so again, Hartman has been criticized by traditional historians about the imagination that's required in terms of crafting this narrative. She continues on to say in Venus in Two Acts, by playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by representing or representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened, or might have been said, or might have been done. All right. And so there's this interesting move that Hartman is making, or I should say, set of moves that she is making when she is engaging in the practice of critical fabulation, right? It's playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story in order to rethink the authorized account, in order to present alternative points of view on a historical subject, on a historical narrative, and then also to then imagine what might have been said, done, or might have happened. But what you notice in this quote, in this text, is that the imagination doesn't come first. The imagination comes after many steps. And so that is what I want us to think about tonight. How and why and by what methods are we able to imagine, especially when we have fragments of a historical record? So how do we explore stories of the past in the face of historical, archival, institutional silence and violence? And this becomes really important, especially again, as I think about my career as a public historian and the institutions where I've worked. I've worked in colleges and universities. I've worked in museums. I've worked in collections of these institutions. And what I've noticed is that there are many gaps and many silences, and yet it's still important to explore the stories of those who have been cast from the center of the narrative. And so thinking about critical fabulation, I think about it in a broader historical toolkit, right? And so when we think about what are the ways in which historians engage in historical inquiry, we have a set of tools that we use. And so I think of critical fabulation as one way of getting to an understanding of the multiple perspectives of the past, and then also exploring diverse stories in the face of silence and violence. And so then to draw from Saidiya Hartman's definition in her explanation of critical fabulation, this is how I interpret it. So we think about authorized accounts, we think about divergent stories, and we think about imagination, or the process of imagining. And so again, when using critical fabulation as a method, anytime I use a theoretical method in my work, I use it as a way to pose questions to my sources, to pose questions to the primary sources, to pose questions to the secondary sources. And so when we are thinking about contesting or troubling authorized accounts, one thing we have to do is we have to first understand what is the authorized account of the event, of the person, of the place, etc. And so what are the basic elements of the story that we can understand through the primary and secondary source research? What are the sequence of events? And who are the main actors, right? So understanding what the authorized, quote unquote, right, account is. Once we understand that, we can then begin to think about divergence. So what are the divergent stories? What does that small scrap in the archive tell us? How does it trouble the authorized account? How does it raise a question about the authorized account? How does it make the authorized account a bit unsettling, right? Whose points of view have been erased, disappeared, forgotten, lost, left unspoken? And it's critical to marinate and reflect on the question of why. Why have these points of views been erased, disappeared, forgotten, lost, left unspoken? And for what benefit? For whose benefit? How can we jeopardize and displace? And I love this word, displace, shake up, make unstable, expose the vulnerability of the authorized account with our divergent stories. And then when we get to imagination, it's based on the sources we have, right? How can we use the sources we have to know as limitedly as we can what might have happened, right? And so again, when we get to the point of imagination, it's holding everything that we have researched and studied to come up with a possible understanding of what might have happened based on the evidence that we have access to. And sometimes our imagination can take us far, and sometimes it won't be able to take us as far as we'd like, because it's still based on, in some senses, what we have access to. But what else could have been said and done? And what are the possibilities? One reason why I love the method of critical fabulation and the ways in which Saidiya Hartman writes about it is that she is very clear, right, that she is dealing with an archive that is incomplete. And because that archive is incomplete, she is using her imagination in a critical way to help us explore what might have happened. And that offers us also, as a reader, as a fellow student and studier, to also think about our own ideas about what might have happened. And so again, I think about critical fabulation as a method, as a way to query my sources, and with the understanding that sometimes there won't be answers. And sometimes the questions will just yield more and more questions. All right, so let's get into some examples of critical fabulation in practice. And so what I want to do here is explore 3 different examples, and I want to go backward in time. I'm going to start with the most recent time chronologically and end with the earliest time chronologically. And so that's just a note in terms of how I'm going to explore these examples. And so these examples all come from the collection of the National Museum of American History. And I will note that the collections of the National Museum of American History are free and available for all to research and study. And their database is available online, and much of it is open access. And so it's a really wonderful way to explore primary sources and artifacts and photographs and documents related to the history of the United States. And even in my current work away from the American History Museum, I still find myself exploring the Smithsonian's collections. But let us start with these 3 examples. So in thinking about critical fabulation in practice, I want to explore a cash register from 1943, a photograph from 1894, and a ledger that was in use from 1732 until 1837. So let's first begin with the cash register from 1943. When I began working at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, I was introduced as the curator who was focusing on African American business and labor history. And so what began to happen is that my colleagues, who had also been exploring these topics in their own roles as curators, began to share with me objects that they knew about in the collection that had a connection to African American business and labor history, as a way for me to do my own assessment of what the collections held related to the topic, so that I could collect and understand and interpret the collection with some facility as I worked in the museum. And so one of these objects that came to me was this cash register that had been brought into the museum's collection in the 1980s. I'll note that the National Museum of American History began as a museum of industry and technology. And so as a museum of industry and technology, it was concerned with documenting industry and technology, but specifically thinking about industries related to agriculture, industries related to trains and planes and automobiles, et cetera. But then also we have, the museum has a phenomenal collection of mathematics implements. And so that includes calculators and cash registers and other ways of counting. And so in the museum's attempt to collect in this area, it had been collecting examples of cash registers as a way to document the technology of the cash register over time. And so, as I mentioned, in the 1980s, this cash register was collected as an example of this particular model of cash register, so model 211. And so what you note in this, what you see on the screen is the description of the cash register that is available to the public on the National Museum of American History's website. And so what you see is a physical and visual description of the cash register that is narrated in text. You understand what types of buttons are on the cash register. You understand the ways in which the keys are situated on the cash register. You learn that the cash register was made in Dayton, Ohio. You learn the serial number of the cash register. And then in the final sentence of the description, you learn that according to a label on the bottom of the cash drawer, this register was made for the Mary Webb Beauty Salon on Orange Street in Wilmington, Delaware. But that's all you really know about this cash register. From the description, you don't even learn that it's connected to African American history. That information was in the knowledge or held by the curator, who was able to do a bit of research to understand that the Mary Webb Beauty Salon was a Black-owned beauty salon in Wilmington, Delaware, that was open during the 1940s. But again, that's really all you learn from the artifact description that's available online. And so then when you begin to think about critical fabulation as a method, and you think about the authorized account, and I just want to go back to our slide where we uncover the questions, we begin to ask ourselves, what are the basic elements of this story? What are its sequence of events? Who are the main actors? And we begin to understand that even answering some of these basic questions become really difficult with the information that we have in the record. And so then, what then do we do? Or what then did I do? What I began to do in order to understand a little bit more about this cash register was I began to research African American history in Wilmington, Delaware. And what I learned is that during the Jim Crow era, there was a thriving and segregated Black community in Wilmington, Delaware. And Orange Street was a street that held many commercial and business establishments. And so that it would make sense that the Mary Webb Beauty Salon would be on Orange Street. Additionally, I began to search for accessible city directories. And one of the things that I love about the primary source of a city directory is that it allows you to understand geographically, again, where people are in the city, and not only where people are, where businesses are. Unfortunately, I was not able to access a city directory from Wilmington, Delaware. But what I was able to access was the Delaware Historical Society, where they had a wonderful resource guide for understanding African American history in Wilmington, Delaware. And this resource guide included many primary sources, many oral history accounts, and also lists and inventories, I should say, of businesses and of influential African Americans in Wilmington, Delaware. And so what I began to understand is that not only do we need to think about the collecting and the understanding of this technology, but this technology as employed and used by African American beauty workers in the city of Wilmington, Delaware. What I also knew from my own study of Black business and labor is that typically beauty work was one way that Black women sought to obtain a measure of authority and autonomy over their own laboring lives. And so we could see also in this cash register the ways in which it offered a tool for economic mobility and autonomy for Black women just by looking at this cash register. So there's so many questions to be asked and answered with this cash register, but understanding that we don't have a lot of information about it. But through understanding Black history in Delaware, through understanding the larger dynamics around economic justice and African American labor history, we can begin to paint a story or paint a picture about the importance of this cash register and what it might have meant to Black beauticians in Wilmington, Delaware. As we move a little bit further in time, I want to explore the next artifact. And this artifact is an image called At the Creek. And it's by a really influential photographer by the name of Rudolph Eckemeyer Jr. And Rudolph Eckemeyer Jr. Really made his mark because he really wanted to expose a vast amount of Americans to the medium of photography. And he endeavored to do that throughout his entire career. While he was engaging in his professional work as a photographer, he also took pictures of many different scenes in nature, of people, etc. At the end of his life, he donated his entire collection to the Smithsonian. And so in the Smithsonian, in the photography history collections, we have photographs that Rudolph Eckemeyer donated. Among these are At the Creek. Now, again, as a way to think about critical fabulation as a method, I wanted to show you again what the description of this image is in the database, right? And so what you see in the description of At the Creek is a biography of Rudolph Eckemeyer, exploring his work and his contributions and his donation to the Smithsonian. You also understand that the collections have been in the care of the Smithsonian for decades, and that it has been our or the Smithsonian's goal to preserve and interpret these collections. But what you don't see is anything related to who appears in this image. And so then again, that gets me to the part of critical fabulation that would help us explore divergent stories, particularly the question around whose points of view have been erased, disappeared, forgotten, lost, and left unspoken, and why. Unfortunately for this image, I was not able to do as much detailed research about it, but really I wanted to leave us with the question, because the question around erasure and disappearance and lost and left unspoken, to me is really provoking, right? Because the question remains, what can we learn? Is it possible to even learn anything about the women pictured, the Black women, the Black laboring women pictured in this photograph? And what do we do about that? And so I leave that question for us to consider. I next want to spend the remainder of the time exploring more in depth an artifact that I've talked about before, I've thought about before, but it remains really elusive. And I think this will resonate to the audience, particularly to folks who are interested in the lives of the enslaved at Tudor Place. And it is the Ming ledger, excuse me. I have been really fascinated, also troubled by, exasperated by, worried about the fact that there's so little known about the contents of this ledger. So while, again, I was working at the American History Museum, one of my colleagues, a collections manager who had the task of working with me to help understand African-American history and African-American artifacts in the collection, she came across this ledger on the shelves of our collection in storage. And she opened it and she tried to figure out what it was, because unfortunately, the ledger was on the shelf, but there wasn't very much material in terms of what it actually was on the shelf with it. And so she had to do a bit of sleuthing to understand in the first place what it was. And finally, she learned that it was indeed this ledger, this Ming ledger that had been in use between 1732 and 1837. Again, I include the description, the metadata of the ledger so that we can look over it together. And so we understand when it was made, the associated dates, the associated people, and some of the subjects that it pertains to. Immediately, what I began to do is I began to, even though I note that I'll be thinking about imagination for this particular artifact, immediately what I began to do actually was figure out what the authorized account of this ledger was. And I began to do that by trying to research and understand David and Christiana Ming. And those are the named associated people with this ledger. And in so doing research on David and Christiana Ming, I was able to find the wills of the Ming family, in particular, David Ming's will. And so in looking at the will, and I was able to access this will through the William and Mary Quarterly, which I was really surprised by, especially because the will had been published in 1911, so centuries after David Ming signed this will, but the William and Mary Quarterly saw fit to publish it in their journal, which in my interpretation meant they thought it was important enough to document and make accessible the will. And so in reading the will, what we learn and what we see is where David Ming resided in Westover County of Charles City. And we also understand that David Ming had daughters, he had offspring, and he also bequeathed to them or left to them assets that he had acquired as a result of his labor, labor in terms of being and owning plantations and in owning enslaved people. And so in the will, what we see is that he names his wife, he names his daughter, and then also what I learned is that it corroborates some of the information that I have found in additional sources, both primary and secondary. We also learn when we look at the end of the will that he signed the will on May 16th, 1779. But as I was investigating the will, I wondered, what else, who else might I see in the will? And so on the second page of the will, David Ming notes that he is bequeathing enslaved people to his offspring. And he names those people. He names Critty, he names Kate, and he names Clementine. And so then what I immediately sought to do was, okay, can I find these names in the ledger? And so I began to try to do that. And what I was able to find in reading the script of the ledger and also asking for help to help me read the cursive handwriting of the 1700s, I was able to see Critty in the ledger, but not Clementine and Kate. And so not all of the people he named were in the ledger. But one of the things to note about the ledger is that the ledger was not just an accounting of the enslaved people that David Ming owned. It was also a financial accounting of the plantations that he owned. And so that meant that that included other goods, it included other expenses, and then it included a couple of pages of list of enslaved people and when they were born. And so that is what you are looking at on the screen. You're looking at the list of enslaved people born on the plantations that David Ming owned, and you're also seeing when they were born. So I was really honestly emotional when I saw Critty in this ledger, because that validated, that let me know, okay, here's Critty. I can see Critty. But I was also wondering about Clementine and Kate. And so I began to explore other primary sources that might help me understand some of the other names and other people that I was seeing and not seeing in the ledger. And in so doing that, I kept coming across a woman who was referred to as being free in Petersburg, Virginia, which is very near Charles City, Virginia, about 30 to 40 miles away, named Aggie Ming. And I kept coming across her name in both primary sources and in secondary sources written by scholars who wrote about the history of free people in Virginia during the 17 and 1800s. And so I was, who is Aggie Ming, right? Who is she? And is she related to the women on the ledger? Divergent story, right? Who is Aggie Ming? And is she related to the women on the Ming ledger? To understand a little bit more about Aggie, again, I continue to research her and try to find her in other sources. And so here are some of what I found. In 1925, Carter G. Woodson, many of us know him as the founder of Negro History Week, which becomes Black History Month. He published this piece on that he entitled Free Negro Heads of Families in the United States in 1830. And what we see is Aggie Ming. She's listed there. In a separate source, a source written by the historian Luther P. Jackson, entitled Manumission in Certain Virginia Cities, Dr. Jackson in a 1930 article writes that there are two women that are liberating enslaved people in Virginia, one by the name of Jane Minor and the other Aggie Ming. In 1824, this free woman of color bought an enslaved person, Louisa Ruffin, from another prosperous free Negro of Petersburg by the name of Shadrach Brander. And after holding this woman as an enslaved person for 8 years, Aggie Ming granted her freedom. I want us to sit with that for a little bit, right? Here we have Aggie Ming, who is a free woman of color, also involved in owning enslaved people. But that's all we know. We don't know anything more about the circumstances of Aggie Ming's ownership of enslaved people. But what we do know is that she manumits Louisa Ruffin, and we have evidence of that. This is Louisa Ruffin's 1832 Deed of Emancipation, and it's signed by Aggie Ming. And so thinking about all of this and going back to the authorized account again, right, of the Ming ledger, and I just want to flip back to the image of it so that we can just reflect on it. All we know from the collections of the National Museum of American History was what was noted in the metadata, which we have here. We don't know much else. One piece of the authorized account that I was able to glean was that David Ming was connected to presidential history. And he was connected to President Harrison, and through distant relations in terms of being a cousin. And so there is some presidential history here. There's that piece of the authorized account. But that really is all we know. In my questions that I've been raising about divergent stories, I really was interested in understanding Critty and Kate and Clementine. But as you see, what I'm left with is more questions instead of answers, especially when I began to notice Aggie Ming in the record, in the historical record. I wondered, is she related to the Ming family? What we know is that she's considered to be a free woman of color, right? And what we see here is a ledger that lists enslaved people. And so she wouldn't necessarily have been noted in this ledger. So who was she? And how might she have been connected to this family, if at all? In terms of the imagination, we could imagine that perhaps Aggie and Critty and Kate and Clementine were perhaps connected, all because they lived within 30 to 40 miles of each other and shared a surname. But that's speculation, right? What I hope to leave us with, again, are these questions about this ledger, what we don't know and what we should know, and who we should and perhaps should not focus on. And I think the addition of Aggie Ming to the conversation helps us also understand the complicated ways in which the institution of slavery played out in these places in Virginia in the 1700s and the 1800s. And so again, as I started with, many times the method of critical fabulation leaves us with more questions than answers. But I think those questions are important to continue to think about and try to answer, or at the very least, pose and understand. And so again, as I conclude, I want to leave us with these provocations, which are really just restatements of the methods of, or the queries that critical fabulation asks us to consider. Authorized accounts, divergent stories, and using our imagination in productive ways. Thank you. Now we have some time for a Q&A, and as Mark mentioned, we can put those in the chat, but I will turn it over to Mark so that he can moderate the chat.
Yeah, we'll see if any questions come up in the chat. In the meantime, I have a couple of questions that have come to mind as I've been listening to this. The first, you'd mentioned archival silence and archival violence. And the archival silence, I think I understand. I wonder if you could expound a little bit upon the concept of archival violence.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mark. When I think of violence, I think not only of kind of the traditional way we might understand violence in terms of physical violence. I think about epistemological violence, and that's the violence that happens when knowledge, when understanding, when interpretation is foreclosed upon, right? And so what are the ways in which the gaps and the silences in the erasures of the archive create epistemological conditions that make it impossible to understand the stories of marginalized or underrepresented folks. And so this inability to understand the stories of your ancestors, of where you come from, to me, I think about that as a violence that affects a people to their core, because it disconnects a person from their roots, both ideologically and physically and historically. And so that's what I mean by violence, thinking about it epistemologically in the ways in which knowledge is foreclosed based on those gaps in the archive.
Mm-hmm. And we do have a question that has come in from Rob DeHart, our curator. To get away from just interpreting enslaved persons through their labor, is it legitimate to use secondary sources to interpret their experiences? For example, describing the life of Patty Allen, a cook at Tudor Place, through the stories of other enslaved cooks. Is that?
Yeah. Yes, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for posing that, Rob. I think that's exactly what critical fabulation asks us to do during the research process. When we have a dearth of information, and particularly primary source information about the subject or the topic at hand or the people at hand, then I think it is incumbent upon us to look at other sources. And I would say not only secondary sources, but also primary sources. And so if there exist, right, in the narratives of other enslaved, other people who are enslaved, who are laboring as cooks, perhaps there are narratives that existed that we have access to. When I think about the story of the cash register from Wilmington, Delaware, that was utilized on Orange Street. Again, I think about the primary sources and the secondary sources related to African-American labor history as it relates to beauticians. And that helps me understand the importance of that cash register, right? You might automatically think of Madam C.J. Walker, right? You might automatically think of Annie Malone, right? As other examples of Black beauticians who were doing work during this time. And there are, for these women, primary sources that we can look to. How might those primary sources, and as you know, those secondary sources help illuminate the lives of the folks that we are attempting to study? I think what we have to be careful of is not declaring, right, that these primary sources are definitive answers, right? But that because we have these sources, they can help us shed light, right, on the subject and the history at hand.
Well, kind of the other side of that, what responsibility do you feel like we have as historians to declare when we're using imagination or fabulation in our work? And I'm thinking again particularly about our interpretation here at Tudor Place. I mean, this is a very useful tool to fill in the gaps that is missing in the documentary history. But what obligation do you feel like we have to declare that, and what's the best way to state it?
I think it's definitely our responsibility. And I think about that in terms of perhaps a tour where you are leading visitors across grounds and you're exploring the lives of enslaved people. I think in that moment you might say, we understand that Patty Allen lived or worked at Tudor Place as a cook, but we don't have all of the sources that might illuminate her life in an expansive way. And so what we've done is we've explored other primary sources and other secondary sources that might help us understand the context in which Patty Allen lived, the types of work, the types of food, right, that Patty Allen might have cooked, right? And so I think it's really important that we are really honest about what we have access to and what we don't have access to. And I think that offers a really wonderful opportunity to have a conversation with visitors about what the archive holds and what it doesn't hold and what it can and what it can't tell us. And so I think it's our total responsibility to be honest and forthcoming, and to do that in a way that invites discussion and that invites further query and understanding and research.
We have some comments and a question from Patricia, who's asking. She says, first of all, this presentation is wonderful, and I think we all agree. When we study family histories, we wonder about the connections and the possibilities of finding relatives. Dr. Moten's lecture reinforces these efforts to connect. I love the 3 examples. I wondered about the cash register, whether ordering a custom-made cash register was common or whether this was a very successful business. In other words, can we draw some conclusions about that? That required such a machine to be better organized, better organize its business. In other words, is that a reflection of how successful the business was, or was it common for someone to go to Dayton and order a machine from the National Cash Register Company?
Now, thank you, Patricia. This is such a great question, and it's going to allow me to put into practice, Mark, what you just asked me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in terms of me knowing specifically about what enabled Mary Webb, the Mary Webb Beauty Salon, to purchase this register, that information is not available to me. But what is available to me is the understanding that during this period, especially when we think about the professionalization of beauty work and the ways in which beauticians across the country were licensing themselves, were opening businesses, and were appealing to an African-American clientele, we can surmise that the very existence of this cash register in this beauty salon perhaps was an indicator of the success of the beauty salon, right? Because we think about this cash register again as a new technology that the museum saw fit to collect as an example, right? And so you then understand if this cash register, which is hard for us to look at now, was cutting edge technology then the salon had to have had resources to be able to afford to custom make and order it. And where did the salon get those resources? From the people who patronized it. And so I think you're on to something, Patricia, in thinking about what we perhaps can understand about the salon by the very nature of the cash registers existence in that salon. And so the other thing that I'll note is the example of Maggie Lena Walker. And Maggie Lena Walker was a very prominent businesswoman in Richmond, Virginia in the early 20th century. And I bring her up as an example because she had as her mission for in her life, the betterment of Black working class women. And to that effect, she ran a mutual aid society, and she also organized the bank. In her bank, she, for her tellers, often purchased the very latest counting machines so that her tellers could count the pennies and the nickels and the dollars that African-American Richmonders would bring to deposit into the bank. And so there is this tradition of Black business proprietors looking toward technology to help them organize their businesses. And so again, by using a separate but distinct and related example, we can begin to understand the importance of this cash register in the lives of this beautician and of this salon.
Okay. Patricia has appended an additional question about the At the Creek photograph, noting that it was included because the photographer felt it would have real educational value. Patricia, just want to know a little bit more about the photographer and the photographer's motives.
Yeah, and so that's the very interesting thing about Rudolph Eckermeyer Jr. is that because he was so prolific in his photography and in his determination to make the medium of photography accessible to a wide array of Americans, we have a lot of information about Rudolph Eckermeyer. And, we can go to the museum's collections to learn more about who he was. And this is interesting because it's who he was according to what we knew about him at the time of his donation of his collection, right? He basically bequeathed the collection to the Smithsonian, and the Smithsonian received it upon his death. And so what we know is that he was a really avid and prolific photographer who wanted to document American life and culture and history. I think there are ways to understand his motives in terms of looking at the primary sources that he may have written about his own photography while he was living, and ways to understand that as well through what we have in the collection. But that's the authorized account, right? Rudolph Eckermeyer's story is the authorized account that the museum is exploring on and through its collecting. And I think it's up to us, as you ask, Patricia, to trouble that authorized account. And the way I trouble that authorized account is not by focusing on Eckermeyer, the photographer, but focusing on the people who I notice in his photography.
Well, I don't see any other questions, but thank you so much, Patricia and Rob, for sharing yours. Thank you again, Dr. Moten, for being with us this evening and sharing these ideas with us that I know will travel forward, certainly with us here at Tudor Place, as we continue our efforts to better document the experiences of particularly the enslaved people here. So as our landmark lecture series draws to a close for this year, I want to take a moment to say thanks to everyone who helped make it an amazing success. And so in addition to the financial support we received from IMLS, I want to thank and express gratitude to the Tudor Place staff who have worked together to organize the programs, promote them, and make them available to a global audience through the live streaming and the YouTube videos. I also want to thank our partners at Georgetown University for their help with our program last month, and all of the speakers who have shared their wisdom and research through these programs during these six events over the past 8 months. And finally, I just want to thank all of you who are joining us by Zoom tonight, and whether you were here for just this program or you've been here for all 6 of these lectures. We really appreciate your participation and your engagement with us, and we hope that this has been a thought-provoking and important experience for you, just as it has been for us. And just to let everyone know, we are working on our 2024 landmark lecture series with the theme of historical memory, commemoration, and memorialization. And so we'll be sharing more details with you through our website and social media and the other ways that we communicate with everyone. So we do look forward to seeing everyone again as the landmark lecture series resumes in March of 2024. In the meantime, we hope that you'll take a look at the Tudor Place website, tudorplace.org. We have some programs coming up in December. We have candlelight tours and Tudor Lights, which is a wonderful event. Hope that everyone will participate in those. And so we hope to see you all soon. Again, thank you, Dr. Moten. And just a special word of thanks too, before I forget, I just want to say a special word of thanks to Rob DeHart, our curator, who really has been our point person on the lecture series this past year. We really been great to work with, and it's been an amazing experience for all of us. So I think that's it for tonight. So I would say drive safely, but I think you're all at home. So have a great night, everyone.